Hi, my name is Andy Van Zant, and I am a professional board game developer. Today I'm going to talk about some misconceptions about pricing, and in particular, uh, things you should consider when you are pricing your products. Um, and the beginning point of that really is the uh, misconception that consumers have a good idea of what a product should be worth. They don't, and there's a lot of things that go into that. They don't have a particularly good idea of the actual value of the physical components, and on top of that, there's a whole lot of intangible things that they don't have a good idea about the value of as well. And that's not going to change, and it's not something you should get mad about or blame the consumer for not knowing. I've mentioned this before. It's the bathroom problem. The first time you're working at a place and somebody asks where the bathroom is, you say, "Oh, it's right over there." The hundredth time, you're like, "Oh man, why can't you the sign? It's right there. You see it?" And that's because you've got a different level of familiarity with what's going on than they do, and it's unfair. It's that hundredth customer is not the same as the first customer. You can't expect customers to have done research into your products beyond maybe some very surface level stuff, and certainly not to a degree where they need to understand the ins and outs of all the production and everything that goes into making a game. So, uh, so it's better to have a good idea of what they're basing their estimations on, um, and and use that to help price your product and not to try and either be mad at the customer or try and educate customers, because you can only ever educate such a very tiny percentage of people. Even if you've got a Kickstarter and it's like the first thing on the Kickstarter and you're like, here's how everything costs, there's very few people who are going to be interested or are going to read through it or understand it, and that's not something that's worth your time. Instead, you just use the information that's already out there to make good choices for your product beforehand. So um, let's talk about the tangible elements of a game first. So stuff has a cost. Any given component will have a cost, and and the consumer has a perceived value associated with that particular component, and that perceived value is very rarely exactly in line with what the actual cost is. Sometimes the perceived value is going to be higher. That's good. Sometimes the perceived value is going to be lower. That's bad. So when you've got a product with different kinds of components in it, you want to err on this side if you can, and at least be off. If you do have components that have a lower perceived value, and this is very common, it's a necessity of what occurs. It's not that you're providing less value; it's that the perceived value is lower. You have to offset that with some higher perceived value stuff. So when you're talking about some of the more basic things like cards, um, consumers actually have a closer value, um, but things like linen texture gives a higher perceived value than the actual cost, and so that's a positive thing. Um, those are the kinds of things that you're looking at. Another thing is plastics, and plastics are a double-edged sword. So plastics can have a higher perceived value, in particular molded plastics like miniatures. Plastic cubes and plain shapes often have a lower perceived value than wood, which is the most common other thing you would use. So uh, it's also a double-edged sword because a lot of people don't think about the cost of the molds ahead of time. Um, you have to have a certain number of units uh, printed in order to offset the mold cost. Otherwise, while the plastic miniature will always have higher perceived value, you will be paying significantly more per unit rather than less per unit to get that perceived value. So for example, let's say that it costs you 11 cents per unit for a particular miniature in your game. It costs you $500 for the mold, and these are just made up numbers, versus 15 cents per unit for a piece of wood, shaped wood meeple, um, but with very low or negligible setup cost, tooling costs to make that piece of wood. we've got a difference of 4 cents per unit, but we have to offset that $500 of mold costs. And to make up 4 cents divided by 500, we need to sell 12,500 units of the game to have equaled the same cost. So you got to keep that in mind when you're doing things, and that's not something that consumers will think about, but do think about that yourself. So plastics can have a better perceived value. Um, silk screening can add perceived value in excess of the cost. In particular, one color silk screening, if done well, can be very beneficial. Um, full color silk screening or 4 color silk screening is often so much more expensive that it's not um, worth the difference, right? Like it's uh, in perceived value. Um, so it the difference, assuming you did a good job on your 1 color and you did a good job on your 4 color silk screening, so you've got more perceived value at 1 color, and then you go up to 4 colors, and yeah, slightly more perceived value, but not a particularly lot, whereas your cost went up significantly for that. Um, so so keep that in mind, that silk screening on wood can add perceived value. A lot of times your multicolored silk screening will not add as much as that first color will. Um, Other different things like finishes can add perceived value. Um, Art is one of the best ways that you can add additional perceived value. And art can cost such a huge range of things. It's another thing you have to pay attention to. You can have 2 games where the consumer is going, man, that art looks great on that game. Man, that art looks great on that game. What should I choose? And maybe the art budget for one was $500. Maybe the art budget for another was $10,000. And they got the same perceived value out of it. So pay attention to that when you're doing it as well. You can get a lot of extra perceived value out of that, but you have to pay attention to when that's a good expenditure and when it's not. Sometimes having an artist's name or a designer's name can add perceived value to a product. And so these are all ways that you can add some more perceived value to it. Um, so those are some more the more tangible things that are out there, and there are other ways. That's not an exhaustive list, but pay attention to uh, what consumers think about stuff versus uh, what the reality is. Um, and if you have a hard time separating yourself, stepping back from your product and looking at it through the consumer's eyes, ask some people that you know what they think about the thing, and try not to taint the results by uh, letting them know what you hope the results will be. So let's talk about the intangible things in games. And this is an important thing to kind of separate from tangible stuff, because tangible stuff has a value, and you're trying to fine tune the perceived value compared to your value when you're determining your price for your product. Um, when you're talking about the intangible things, there's the actual cost for it, and the perceived value is off the chart. It's not even on the screen, because the consumer has uh, very little or no clue uh, about that cost, and it just doesn't factor in. There are always exceptions. There are always individuals who have some amount of information and use that in a good way, but uh, the vast majority, the 99.999% of consumers don't have that information or aren't using it in a way that's useful to you. Um, and it's not their fault. It's not a bad thing. It's just the way things are. Uh, so when I'm talking about intangible things, um, we're talking about design, development, art, graphic design, shipping, all these little things. Marketing is a huge one that just for sure 100% costs money and time. And uh, if you asked your average consumer, they would have no clue, and it certainly didn't factor into their subconscious evaluation of how much this game should cost. Um, Designers is the unfortunately one of the biggest discrepancies there. Designers can take 30 hours to make a game. They can take 3,000 hours to make a game, and it is very rare if they take 300 hours and they got paid minimum wage. That costs more than the entire print run of a game in a lot of cases, and it's completely unfair. But that is how the industry works currently. Um, uh, Developers and artists and graphic designers add all this invaluable stuff, this amazing stuff to a game, and the consumer has no idea how many hours went into that. They have no idea how much value it's actually adding to the product. Um, and and marketing, right? Like you can have a game where you bought Facebook ads and Reddit ads and BGG ads, and maybe you talk to local newspapers and radio people, and you spent hours trying to push this. You spent money at conventions. You all the stuff you do to prepare for a Kickstarter, for example, can all be considered in the marketing realm, and the consumers have no idea how much you spent. They don't see all the different ways in which it occurred, and it's just completely intangible expenditures that are a part of the cost of making the game, but are not factored into the consumer's understanding of that cost or perceived value associated with that game. And so one of those things is that's also on the list of intangible things is shipping. And you'll see all sorts of different approaches to this from different companies, and they'll all claim theirs is the best way. Um, so when you're talking about shipping, maybe again the easiest example is Kickstarter. Some companies will say free shipping, and it's free shipping. It just means it's included in the cost of the game. Um, and because the shipping is never actually free. Uh, and and a lot of times, if you see a fixed cost for shipping, that means some portion of it is included in the cost of the game. Because, for example, if something says $5 shipping to the U.S., it probably costs more than that to ship to the U.S. At any given place, and there's a range of costs. And they'll just say $5 shipping to the U.S. and the extra $1 to $10 it actually costs to ship within the U.S. Is that they just eat from their margin. Um, and the consumers don't see that, and this will work against you because they'll be like, oh, this other company offered free shipping, and why can't you? And it's like, okay, well, that shipping wasn't free. You did pay for it. You just didn't realize you paid for it. That's not actually the discussion you should have. You should just keep in mind that no matter what your shipping cost is, people will yell at you for it existing. For there being any shipping cost, and this goes quadruple for overseas shipping. Intangible things regarding shipping don't stop there. They're just basically infinite. Shipping is such a uh, uh, a diverse thing that and has so many costs that the consumers don't see. People will be like, oh, why don't you? Why is the shipping to my overseas country so expensive? So if you take your average euro sized game and send it from the US to New Zealand, you're talking 80 something dollars. If you send it to Portugal, it's 50 something dollars. And that's a really hard sell when you're talking about a game that costs $50 to begin with. And so a lot of companies will amortize that into their costs. An expensive game like a $100 or $200 game has more margin that exists within it just because it is a larger game, and thus can amortize its costs better, amortize more costs into it. It's a they can potentially eat this huge shipping cost elsewhere. Um, and so that's misleading people. People are like, oh, why did Gloomhaven only cost me this much to get me to this foreign country? Why can't your smaller title? And it's like, yeah, you paid for that. It was in the margin. They just had a bigger margin to work with to eat that cost, and it's completely unfair. And you can't argue that point with them. But that's the reality, and so those are things you have to keep in mind. Um, uh, Similarly, when people are talking about country-friendly shipping, like or region-friendly shipping, like EU-friendly shipping or Australia-friendly shipping, um, all the stuff that goes into making that friendly is completely ignored. The part where to make it friendly, you have to make an arrangement. Very few companies have branches in multiple countries, and can actually do all that friendly shipping in-house. Instead, what you're doing is you're paying another company who is making profit off of this stuff to do this, to accept a shipment, to go to a dock, pick up pallets of stuff, take it back to their warehouse, which they have to pay money for, pay employees to unpack and inventory this stuff, and then to organize it and pick certain things based on the individual's order and ship it out to the thing. All of these things cost money, and this contracted company is making a profit off of all of these things. It's totally fine, but the consumer applies no value to that whatsoever. Uh, so, um, so, so keep it in mind. Like I could talk about shipping forever. Honestly, I probably talked too long about it, but all these intangible things, shipping, design, development, art, graphic design, marketing. These are all intangible things that the consumer applies almost no perceived value to, and that you will have to use things like the perceived value of the material product or marketing techniques to help try and offset. And uh, so what do you do to solve those problems? You're doing, you have to do something to offset the issue where you've got this disparity of their perception of the value and the reality of the cost. And usually the most common answer is marketing. Let's talk about a Kickstarter. A Kickstarter can have exclusives, some fear of missing out stuff. It could be Kickstarter only even. Um, it could have early bird specials. Um, it could have celebrity endorsements or any other kind of marketing thing. And uh, again, this is one of those things where you'll run into the problem where people will yell at you for using any kind of marketing technique whatsoever, and those people are the minority. You can't say I will not use any kind of marketing technique whatsoever to help people be aware of the value of this product, because the reality is that Kickstarter has shown over and over and over again that people actually want those exclusives. Those things are, there are way more people to whom that is a benefit, compared to the vocal minority who will tell you that you're a bad person for doing this. And it's important to make distinctions here, when because I don't think uh, anyone wants to feel like a dishonest car salesman kind of trope when they're doing this. And it's a really easy line to draw, when you're talking about an exclusive. You say this is a Kickstarter exclusive, and it's true. You're providing the information to them, and it might make them want to have something more, but it is being 100% honest and upfront. Here's an early bird special. Here's whatever you're enticing people with or trying to get their attention with, as long as you're being honest, that's not you being sketchy. That is uh, just the reality of things. You will actually have people argue the opposing point, which is the reality that why should I back this Kickstarter if there's not some kind of exclusive, right? Um, and for some people, the idea that the game wouldn't get made otherwise is good enough. For a lot of people, they want that exclusive. Those people don't go to battle with the other people for you. You just have to realize that there's the vocal minority is yelling at you, calling you a bad person for marketing that is not tricky. It is literally just, here's this information. We are doing this in this particular way. It is 100% honest. It is not somebody not informing you of other options. It's not a person trying to um, upsell you on something that is worse. It is, here's this information. Uh, uh, do with it what you want, and that is not being sketchy by doing that. And I'm sure there's a million people who will argue with me, but the reality is that, again, Kickstarter's shown over and over again that the majority of consumers don't feel that way. And so you have to pay attention to what is the vocal minority and what is the reality of the market currently. Um, so just any general marketing things, those are ways that you can offset this issue where consumers don't understand these uh, intangible costs associated with a product. Um, and another hurdle that you're often fighting is other companies. So the other companies are doing things differently from you. Very few companies have the exact same model of business. Some companies have 90% of their sales are direct, like Kickstarter or online, and 10% are through stores or less. Some are the opposite. Almost all their sales are online and almost none are direct. Some sell a lot of their games through conventions or other means. And conventions as a form of marketing is another thing that people put zero value on. It'll cost you thousands of dollars to have a booth, maybe tens of thousands, or in some cases hundreds of thousands of dollars to have a booth and staff it and make it cool. Uh, and the perceived value is nothing to the consumer. That's not the important thing. These are marketing expenses. You're trying to make them aware of your product and your brand. So they are still valuable things for you to do, but keep in mind that they are not they are not factored in when the consumer is looking at the cost of a product. Um, so you got this wide disparity of companies that have very different business models and have very different things they're trying to accomplish, and they will price their games differently. That they'll have different levels of margin because of the different ways they do things. Uh, and um, and they'll talk about it and they'll talk about it as if their way is the only way and it's the obvious way, and that their truth is universally true, and that's not the case. They'll say, oh, why doesn't everybody just use my shipping methodology? Why doesn't everybody do this particular thing for their consumer? And 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 it just ignores the part where different business models work differently for different people. Um, so uh, that's another case where you have to when you're listening to that kind of information, take it, absorb it, understand that this way works for this particular company, um, but but look at it through the lens of trying to understand which parts of it are actually applicable to the way in which your company works. And and make intelligent decisions based on those things, and and try not to get caught up in what the vocal minority will try and put forth as um, the a majority opinion when it's not really. So thanks for watching. I'll talk to you next time.